Throughout the build-up to Blue, Axis forces in the Crimea continued their brutal reduction of Sevastopol, pulverizing the city through air bombardment and almost ceaseless artillery fire. In early June, German and Romanian infantry began working their way through the outer defenses towards high ground overlooking the port. On June the 20th, the Germans reached the harbour. Maintaining supplies to the garrison now became impossible. The deluge of fire continued to pour down on the city for a further 2 weeks, killing and maiming thousands of soldiers and civilians. In early July, when the Crimea was finally conquered and the remaining German and Romanian forces freed for service further east, the Soviet death toll would be impossible to calculate. Such was the scale of the carnage and confusion. As the battle for Sevastopol drew to an end, spoiling operations were being launched against the Soviet positions east of Kharkov. The aim was to soften up the front in preparation for the launch of Blue. By the end of June, Hitler's preparations for Blue were complete. Along a line stretching from Oryol in the north to Taganrog on the Sea of Azov, he had amassed 74 divisions in 7 armies. Most of these had recently been strengthened, some considerably, in anticipation of the coming offensive. Opposing them, the Soviet forces amounted to 15 armies, grouped in 3 fronts. But these armies were normally equivalent to only 2 or 3 German divisions, and after Kharkov, many of them were in no fit state to fight. The first thrust of Plan Blue would be spearheaded by the 4th Panzer Army. This was stationed between Kursk and Oryol and was commanded by General Hermann Hott. Hott's task would be to launch the drive towards Voronezh and the Upper Don. Fourth Panzer consisted of 11 divisions, of which 3 were armoured and 2 mechanized. By reinforcing 4th Panzer with unmechanized infantry divisions, Hitler significantly increased its strength while compromising its speed and mobility. Supporting 4th Panzer was Army Group Weichs, a German-Hungarian force under the command of General Maximilian von Weichs. Weichs' army group consisted of his own Second Army, which he had commanded since 1940, and which now included 1 motorized infantry, 4 German and 2 Hungarian divisions, and the Hungarian Second Army with a further 4 Hungarian divisions. Facing these forces stood the Soviet Bryansk Front. This was commanded by General Philipp Golikov and was by far the strongest of the 3 fronts. The Bryansk front consisted of 4 armies. Though numerically weak, they were comparatively fresh and well equipped, and had recently been reinforced by the 5th Tank Army in response to fears of an attack in this sector. South of Kursk, the German 6th Army was assembling in the area between Kharkov and Belgorod. 6th Army was commanded by General Friedrich Paulus and had been massively reinforced in preparation for Blue. For the advance to the Middle Don, Paulus had 18 divisions, of which 2 were armoured and 1 was mechanized. Most of these divisions were veteran formations and amongst the best in the German order of battle. Facing 6th Army was the Soviet Southwest Front. While this was still commanded by Marshal Timoshenko, it had not yet recovered from the disasters of the spring and offered him little prospect of an early return to favor. Although Timoshenko's front boasted 5 armies, they were all exhausted, weakened, and demoralized by their failure outside Kharkov. In the southern sector, the 1st Panzer Army was commanded by General Paul Ewald von Kleist. Spearheading the attack across the Donets and the Don towards the Caucasus, Kleist's Panzer Army had 16 divisions. Though, like 4th Panzer, most of these were unmechanized infantry, and 4 of those Romanian. Supporting 1st Panzer, and commanded by General Richard Ruoff, was the 17th Army. Attacking in parallel to 1st Panzer, 17th Army consisted of a further 12 divisions. 4 of them Romanian, and again reflected the dispersal of armored and mechanized formations across the length of the front. The Italian 8th Army, with its 6 ill-equipped and unreliable divisions, comprised the reserve. The Soviet Southern Front was commanded by General Rodion Malinovsky and was charged with the defense of the lower Donets and the Don. The Southern Front also consisted of 5 armies, but the front generally had suffered heavy losses in the battle for Kharkov and remained well below establishment in equipment and men. Disparities on the ground were matched by equally great disparities in the air. In preparation for Blue, the Germans had amassed most of their available aircraft in the south, placing them all under the operational command of the 4th Air Fleet. This would give them a high degree of coordination and concentration in the target sector. Lacking reliable intelligence of German intentions, the Red Air Force was more evenly deployed and grouped in a series of commands, loosely tied to the army fronts. Although technical improvements and mass production had at last given it a fighting chance against the Luftwaffe, its command structure remained awkward, and its pilots still lacked confidence and skills. In many respects, Hitler's faith in Blue was not entirely unfounded. He possessed superior forces in the south and still retained the element of surprise. But he had now committed almost all his reserves. Far to the east, however, beyond the range of German reconnaissance, a further 10 Soviet armies were being assembled. These would be sent into battle only as the crisis developed. Early in the morning of June the 28th, massed concentrations of German artillery announced the opening of Blue. All along the northern sector of the front, the guns roared, while waves of aircraft streamed overhead, their missions carefully planned and their targets precisely defined. They struck savagely at airfields, communication centers, strategic towns, and military strongpoints. Soviet reconnaissance aircraft were ruthlessly hunted down and were soon driven from the skies completely. A sense of shock and confusion gripped the Bryansk front. In the 13th and 40th Army sectors, German infantry and tanks were slicing through the forward defenses, threatening to dislocate Golikov's left flank and shatter the junction between the Bryansk and southwest fronts. By mid-morning, it was clear that the attack was a major operation and that dangerous gaps were being torn in the front line. While 4th Panzer and its supporting infantry armies were scissoring into the Bryansk front, the second phase of Blue was unleashed against Timoshenko's southwest front. Again, German infantry and armor crashed into 21st Army, further threatening the already perilously weak junction between Timoshenko's 21st and Golikov's 40th. Soon, the whole front was in motion. In early July, 1st Panzer and 17th Army jumped off from their start lines west of the Donets. Everywhere the Russians fell back under the weight of the onslaught. By July the 5th, forward elements of 4th Panzer had reached the Don near Voronezh and begun advancing through the western suburbs of the city. Between the Bryansk and the southwest front, there was now a gap more than 150 miles wide, through which German second echelon formations were streaming. Yet the Russians, for the first time in the war, were not fighting to hold hopelessly exposed positions, but retreating in reasonable order, as ponderous German pincers closed impotently on stragglers and rearguards. These were not the great encirclements that Hitler had hoped for, or that had characterized all previous German offensives. Yet the poverty of the catch would only serve to convince Hitler that the Red Army was on its last legs, while other, more measured assessments would indicate that, on the contrary, it was at last learning how to fight a modern war. In Voronezh, the remnants of 40th Army held out for several days, while the 5th Tank Army, hastily mobilized and rushed south, mounted desperate attacks on the flanks of 4th Panzer's advance. Though doomed to failure, the battle for Voronezh, by embroiling 4th Panzer's spearheads in a contest for the city, gained vital time for Timoshenko, enabling the battered armies of the southwest front to be pulled back to the line of the Don, and for the first reserve armies to be fed into the battle. In the south, the fighting for Rostov and the Don crossings was, if anything, even more intense. Aware of the disasters that had befallen Timoshenko, and fearing that his own southern front would be enveloped from the north, Malinovsky had fallen back, fighting a determined and skillful rearguard, while the core of his 5 armies escaped to the south. Angered by these delays, and believing that the Soviet center had fallen apart, Hitler now made the first of a series of fundamental alterations to the plan. 4th Panzer was detached from 6th Army, along with 6th Army's own integral armored spearhead, and sent south to assist 1st Panzer force a crossing of the lower Don. This diversion reduced 6th Army to a march, and further enabled the Russians to consolidate their positions along the line of the Don and in the Don Bend. The decision was even more remarkable for the fact that the Don steppe was ideal terrain for tanks, while the lower Don and the Caucasus were anything but. By now, both sides had reorganized their forces and reordered their priorities. The overwieldy German Army Group South had been replaced by 2 smaller army groups. Army Group A consisted of both panzer armies and the 17th Army, while Army Group B consisted of the 2nd Army, the 6th Army minus its panzer arm, the Hungarian 2nd Army, and the Italian 8th Army. This division of force signaled a strategic change of direction. Of the 16 armoured and mechanized divisions in the field, Army Group A now had 15, leaving Army Group B not only virtually bereft of mobile forces, but with a dangerously high proportion of Axis satellite divisions. Moreover, it was Army Group B that had to hold the line of the Don, seize Stalingrad on the Volga, and bear the brunt of any Soviet counteroffensive, while the three predominantly German armies of Army Group A struck south into the Caucasus. Facing these, there were now 4 Soviet fronts. The Bryansk front, though shorn of its left wing, held the sector east of Oryol. East of Voronezh, and holding the northern shoulder of the Don Bend, stood the Voronezh front, created by Stalin while the battle for the city was at its fiercest, and reinforced with 2 armies from the reserve. In the Bend itself, and standing directly in the path of German Army Group B, a new front was being formed. The Stalingrad front comprised 3 reserve armies along with surviving elements of Timoshenko's southwest front. The Stalingrad front was charged with the defense of the Don Bend and the approaches to the Volga. On the lower Don, and facing the full weight of Army Group A, the southern front was in the process of disengaging in preparation for a full-scale retreat. When 4th Panzer reached the Don east of Rostov, the battle for the city was entering its final stages. Barricades were everywhere. The Don bridges were wired for demolition, and Soviet rearguards manned fire points on every street corner. This, like the fighting on the Upper Don and in the Donetsk corridor, was quite different from anything the Germans had previously encountered in their drive through Russia. This was a fighting retreat, cleverly organized and conducted with skill and determination. The defense of Rostov, which eventually fell on July the 23rd, enabled corps formations of the Southern Front to escape to the south and east. With the Don crossings secured and the eastward march of 6th Army now flagging in the stifling heat of high summer, Hitler again altered his dispositions, detaching 2 armored and 3 mechanized divisions from 4th Panzer to assist Paulus in the Don Bend, and then ordering the infantry rump of 4th Panzer with its single remaining armored division to turn northeast and attack across the Don steppe towards the Volga. While the panzers raced backwards and forwards across the steppe, and the German infantry marched and fought over the drab plains of southern Russia, the Red Army was to stand and fight. If it fell back from the Don, it would not fall back beyond the Volga. In late July, 6th Army resumed its offensive in the Don Bend. Armored spearheads were driven into the flanks of the Soviet front, while the infantry maintained steady pressure in the center. In the northern sector, the attacks made good progress. Armored and mechanized forces broke through the Russian defenses and began cutting their way southeast towards Kalach. On the lower Don, 6th Army's southern pincer smashed into the junction of the 62nd and 64th Armies. The fighting in the Don Bend persisted through the first 3 weeks of August. While 6th Army hacked its way east, 4th Panzer advanced steadily northwards, rolling back the front into the isthmus between the Don and the Volga. In early August, Stalin once again reorganized the command structure in the south. The Stalingrad front was reduced from 6 to 4 armies, though 2 of these, the 38th and 28th, were reinforced from the Armored Reserve and redesignated as tank armies. The newly created Southeast Front also consisted of 4 armies. But while the Stalingrad front ran for most of its length along the northern flank of 6th Army's offensive, the armies of the Southeast Front lay directly in the path not only of 6th Army, but of the 4th Panzer Army. By August the 10th, Paulus had largely completed the clearance of the Don Bend directly west of Stalingrad. But in the northern sector, the Russians still held a number of important positions on the west bank. These proved almost impossible to pinch out and served to further delay Paulus's advance east. For Hitler, the drive to the Volga was taking far longer than he had originally anticipated and was becoming a cause for serious concern amongst the German High Command. In contrast, the progress of German Army Group A was startling. After jumping off from its bridgeheads on the lower Don on July the 25th, it had fanned out on a broad front. While the 17th Army swung west towards the Black Sea, the 1st Panzer Army attacked to the south and east, sweeping through country largely abandoned by the Russians. On August the 9th, forward units of 1st Panzer reached the northern foothills of the Caucasus, a distance of more than 300 miles. In the Don Bend, however, there was furious activity. While the fighting in the north continued, German assault troops prepared to storm the river at its closest conjunction with the Volga. The operation, originally scheduled for August the 19th, was postponed for a further 2 days and finally launched on August the 21st, along a frontage of some 20 miles. By the morning of the following day, 22 pontoon bridges had been thrown over the Don, and German infantry and armor was once again rolling east thrust. Had these tactics been employed in mid-July, Stalingrad could have been taken off the march. In late August, when the strategic aims of Blue had become transparently clear, and the Soviet High Command had recovered from its initial shock, they carried a serious element of risk. While Paulus's armored spearhead hurtled east over the broad, flat plains, the full weight of the 4th Air Fleet was unleashed on Stalingrad. Massed formations of German bombers laid down a carpet of destruction. Later that day, forward units of 16th Panzer reached the Volga north of Stalingrad. In its drive to the Volga, 16th Panzer had sliced away the southeast front from the Stalingrad front. But in so doing, it had become dangerously exposed. In its wake, the motorized infantry formations had encountered stiffening resistance and had failed to keep pace with the armor. With its back to the Volga and with stocks of fuel and ammunition running low, 16th Panzer was now isolated. While the supporting infantry fought its way forward, 16th Panzer was rocked by furious Soviet counteroffensives, unrolling from the north and south. For 6 days it held fast to its positions on the Volga, ranging its guns on the river traffic and mounting sporadic attacks through the sprawling northern suburbs of Stalingrad. Overhead, the Luftwaffe continued its campaign of slaughter and destruction. Thousands of sorties were flown over the stricken city. The anti-aircraft defenses were overwhelmed, and Soviet fighters swept from the sky. With remorseless logic, Stalingrad on the Volga, once a famous citadel of the Tsars and the gateway to Asia, was being slowly pounded into rubble. Towards the end of August, the Soviet armies of the Southeast Front were being pressed relentlessly from the south and west. Between the Don and the Volga, a huge salient was formed by the northerly thrust of the 4th Panzer Army and the continuing pressure of 6th Army's infantry. The Soviet left flank was held by the 57th and 51st Armies and was safely anchored along a line of saltwater lakes. But the 62nd, and to an even greater extent the 64th, held dangerously exposed positions in the salient. On August the 29th, 4th Panzer mounted a major offensive through the center of the salient towards Stalingrad. The attack sliced into the rear of the 64th Army, threatening it and part of the 62nd with encirclement. 6th Army was ordered to detach mobile forces from the Volga corridor and strike quickly south to join up with 4th Panzer's spearhead. But the corridor was only just holding, and subject to increasingly frantic attacks by the 4th Tank Army. The pressure in the north tied up 6th Army's mobile formations for 3 vital days, enabling the Soviet forces in the salient to conduct a fighting retreat, escaping eastwards to inner defense lines west of the Volga. Once again, the Germans had failed to achieve a major encirclement, further prolonging the campaign and ensuring that the fight for the city would be long and hard. At the end of August, General Zhukov assumed overall command of the Soviet forces in the south. Zhukov's task was to coordinate the various front commands, organize the defense of Stalingrad, and maintain pressure on 6th Army's vulnerable left flank. In early September, while the German ring closed around the city, Zhukov mounted a series of offensives from the north. Though failing to break through the German cordon, the attacks helped to hinder 6th Army's advance by diverting attention and forces from the center to the periphery. Meanwhile, Soviet reserves continued to flow south, some to reinforce the 62nd Army in Stalingrad, but many more to bolster the flanks and to provide Zhukov with the necessary strength and flexibility to mount local counterattacks. In mid-September, Soviet pressure in the north eased off enough to allow Paulus to resume his efforts in Stalingrad. The city was now surrounded on 3 sides, and the Volga crossings were under fire from German artillery. On the 13th, the Germans attacked through the southern suburbs, edging forward under cover of airstrikes and supported by tanks and artillery. The objective was the main landing stage, handling ferry traffic from the East Bank. Initially, the attacks made good ground, but as the Germans advanced, Soviet resistance began to intensify. Amid the ruins of the city center, they soon became bogged down in vicious street fighting. General Chuikov, commanding 62nd Army, reorganized and rallied the defenders, creating a series of mini-fortresses and funneling the Germans into killing zones. These were carefully mapped out, ringed with anti-tank weapons, and precisely targeted by artillery batteries situated on the far shore. Gradually, the Germans fought their way forward, pressing in now from the north as well as the south. Some isolated strongpoints held out for days, others changed hands several times. Often the front line was no more than an interior wall, or the floor space separating different levels in the same building. Gains were measured in yards, weighed against the cost in casualties, and held on to desperately in the face of almost suicidal Soviet counterattacks. Overhead, clouds of bombers continued to pulverize what remained of the Soviet rear. Hardly a single building now remained intact. The landing areas were clogged with corpses, and the river channels with the hulks of burning ferries. Yet somehow or other, in small groups, Soviet reinforcements continued to get through. Those that reached the front were already veterans, survivors of the grim and perilous journey across the Volga. Stalingrad had become a place of horror, a vortex of fire and noise. Small arms clattered incessantly, punctuated only by the rumble of artillery, the whine and thud of ordnance, and the deafening crash of bombs. The fighting grew more intense, more personal, and more savage. Even the drains and sewers became the setting for small, murderous clashes between heavily armed infiltration groups. In a series of such brutal encounters, headlong assaults and slow, grinding offensives, the Germans gradually fought their way through the city center towards the Volga. At the end of September, the Germans switched the main focus of their offensive from the southern and central sectors of Stalingrad to the factory district in the north. Three great complexes dominated the skyline: the Red October, barricades, and tractor factories. These massive concrete fortresses reared up out of a sea of rubble, many of their workshops still turning out tanks, guns, and ammunition for the front. With the main landing stage and most of the city center now in German hands, these strongholds comprised the last major pocket of Soviet resistance. On October the 3rd, the Germans attacked with 5 divisions along a 3-mile front. Tanks crunched over mountains of debris, firing at point-blank range into rubble-filled streets. Behind them, the infantry advanced cautiously, visibly wary of the dangers that lurked unseen among the shadows in the broken buildings. As it had in the south, the German offensive in the north soon began to flag. The Russians contested every foot of ground, every floor and workshop. Factory workers and soldiers fought side by side. No quarter was given, and no prisoners taken. But for the Russians, now fighting with their backs to the Volga, there was not even the possibility of retreat. Fresh reserves were brought up by both sides, and the fighting flared and raged among the craters and ruins. On October the 14th, in an attempt to maintain the momentum of the attack, Paulus committed what remained of his reserves, driving to within a few hundred yards of the Volga. The Germans now controlled 90% of the city, but the Russians still held a tenuous bridgehead, for which it seemed they were quite prepared to sacrifice their lives. Paulus's troops were by now exhausted, but this was the least of his concerns. To achieve even this incomplete victory, he had in the preceding weeks stripped his flanks of all the combat forces they could conceivably shed. He had lied to Hitler, grossly exaggerating the size of the force he faced in Stalingrad. And now reports were coming in of major Soviet troop concentrations on the flanks. Added to this, the first frosts of winter had arrived earlier than expected. Cold winds blew in from the east, and flecks of snow had begun to pepper the rubble, the charred timbers, and the grey uniforms of his men. Far to the south, the advance of German Army Group A had likewise ground to a halt, achieving little of its early promise. When Kleist's 1st Panzer Army reached Maikop, the oil fields were ablaze, the scale of destruction so extensive that a year's work would be required to bring them back into operation. The remaining oil-producing areas lay south of the Caucasus, a 700-mile-long chain of untamed mountains, stretching from the Black Sea to the Caspian Sea, and crowned by the 18,000-foot-high peak of Mount Elbrus. There were few passes, and those that existed were high, tortuous, and easy to defend. Throughout August and September, German mountain troops had probed for a way through. But in October, when the onset of winter made further attempts futile, they were still no nearer to their objectives. In preparation for the launch of the offensive, the Soviet fronts were once again reorganized. In place of the old Stalingrad front, two new fronts were created, the Southwest and Don fronts, while the Southeast front was now renamed as the Stalingrad front. The offensive was scheduled to be launched in two stages. In Stage 1, the Soviet armies of the Southwest front would attack out of the Don bridgeheads, striking south and east through the Don Bend towards the town of Kalach. In Stage 2, timed for the following day, heavily reinforced formations deployed on the left wing of the Stalingrad front would attack westwards towards the Don, with the overall aim of encircling the mass of the German forces investing Stalingrad. While the Soviet pincers sliced through the German rear, the armies of the Don front, and even those on the tattered right wing of the Stalingrad front, would maintain pressure in the center. Though ambitious, the plan was basically sound, capitalizing on the growing overextension of Axis forces in the Stalingrad sector. Most of the German 6th Army and all of the 4th Panzer Army were now concentrated between the Don and the Volga, leaving the flanks weakly held by 4 unreliable and under-strength Axis satellite armies. Of these, it was upon the Romanian 3rd and 4th armies that the main weight of the Soviet offensive would fall. Throughout October and early November, While the Russians completed their build-up on the ground, the Red Air Force was gradually winning the battle for mastery in the air. At first, Soviet air operations in the Stalingrad sector had been confined to the hours of darkness or to localized raids. But as more and better aircraft became available, the raiding strategy was discarded in favor of one of all-out offense. Aerial dominance in key sectors of the battle zone was essential to ensure success on the ground. More than 1 million Russian soldiers would be thrown against the Axis lines, and the final deployments would be difficult to disguise. German reconnaissance efforts had to be frustrated, and as the attack got underway, Soviet breakthrough forces would need to be given adequate fighter cover and tactical air support. At dawn on November the 19th, the Soviet offensive opened with concentrated artillery attacks on the Romanian positions opposite the southwest front. The barrage was devastating. In the preceding days, thousands of guns, mortars, and Katyusha rocket launchers had been secretly assembled in narrow breakthrough sectors. In a crescendo of fire, the Romanian lines were torn apart, trenches obliterated, and bunkers and pillboxes demolished. By midday, the Romanian Third Army had been pushed aside, and Soviet tanks and infantry were swarming over the plains. On the following day, the second stage of the offensive was launched against the Romanian Fourth Army in the Don-Volga Isthmus. Once again, the great swirling mass of Soviet armor and infantry overwhelmed the defense. Russian cavalry streamed through the gaps. Army Group B was in chaos. In all sectors, the pressure was intense. Attacks were launched against 6th Army's positions in the Don Bend, against 4th Panzer to the south of Stalingrad, and out of the Stalingrad bridgehead itself. Assailed on all sides and harassed from the air, the German forces in the Stalingrad sector were unable to react in time to stem the flood. 3 days later, after a blistering drive through the Don Bend, Soviet forces of the Southwest Front linked up with those of the Stalingrad Front, thus completing the encirclement of the mighty German 6th Army and most of the 4th Panzer Army. While the Russians feverishly reinforced the ring, the fighting continued in Stalingrad. Buoyed by reports of the catastrophe that had overtaken 6th Army, Zhuikov's 62nd Army fought with renewed confidence and vigor. At last there was hope, not merely of relief, but of a heroic and crushing victory against all the odds. On 3 occasions, while the opportunity still existed, Paulus requested permission to mount a breakout to the southwest. On each occasion, his request was denied. Hitler would countenance no withdrawal from the Volga. Stalingrad was to be turned into a fortress, and until 6th Army could be relieved, it would be supplied by airlift. From the outset, the air... At the end of November, Hitler created Army Group Don to hold the line between Army Groups A and B. Army Group Don was commanded by General Erich von Manstein and consisted of the 6th Army in the Stalingrad pocket, which now included the encircled elements of the 4th Panzer Army, the remnants of the 4th Romanian Army, and a reconstituted 4th Panzer Army, cobbled together from support units and bolstered by 4 weak panzer divisions. Manstein's plan was to attack through the Don-Volga Isthmus, where the Russian infantry was most exposed, enabling 6th Army to break out to the southwest. The plan had 2 flaws. The first was Hitler's opposition to any withdrawal from the Volga. The second was that, unbeknown to Manstein, the Soviets were preparing their own offensive. This would be mounted by the Voronezh and Southwest fronts, and would be launched against the Italian 8th Army on the right flank of Army Group B, with the aim of cutting off all the German forces south of the Don. The Don and Stalingrad fronts would meanwhile maintain the pressure on 6th Army in the Stalingrad pocket and repel any attempt at relief. Despite careful planning and tactical support from the Luftwaffe, Manstein's relief offensive had little real prospect of success. With only 2 armored divisions committed to the attack, there was no possibility of forcing a permanent corridor across the 60 miles of snow-covered steppe to Stalingrad. At best, Manstein's forces could press only part of the way, harass and disorganize the Soviet forces in the ring, and provide one last opportunity for 6th Army to break out. Inevitably, on December the 19th, after a week of heavy fighting, the relief offensive was finally brought to a halt along the line of the Mishkova River, barely halfway to Stalingrad. For a further 5 days, the Germans held these forward positions in the forlorn hope that Paulus would defy Hitler's express command and order 6th Army to attempt a breakout. For Army Group Don, the situation was growing more perilous by the day. On December the 16th, the Russians had sliced through the Italian 8th Army, decimating 5 of its divisions and throwing the rest into panic. There was now a gap, some 90 miles wide, between Army Groups B and Don. On Christmas Eve, the relief forces in the Don-Volga Isthmus began withdrawing from their forward positions on the Mishkova River. Simultaneously, Army Group A was secretly preparing to abandon the Caucasus. The fate of 6th Army was now inescapable. Throughout January of 1943, the Russians tightened the noose around 6th Army, while simultaneously thrusting ever westwards across the Don and the Donets towards Rostov. On January the 12th, the storm broke over the Hungarian 2nd Army on the Upper Don. The destruction of the Axis satellite armies in Russia was now complete. While Soviet armor rolled through the Donetsk corridor towards Kharkov, the Germans rushed frantically to seal the gaps and stabilize the line. Everything won over the course of Blue was being rapidly abandoned. Only 6th Army remained in position, but utterly surrounded and increasingly isolated in the ruins of Stalingrad. The final phase of the Russian assault on 6th Army began on January the 22nd. By now, the Stalingrad pocket had been reduced to a third of its original size, and 6th Army was separated from Army Group Don by 160 miles of steppe. That day, the Russians overran the last serviceable airfield available to Paulus. For 10 more days, The survivors of Sixth Army fought on to the limits of their strength and endurance. Soviet attacks unrolled from every direction. On January the 25th, Russian troops advancing from the west linked up with units of the 62nd Army in the Volga bridgehead. Sixth Army was now cut in half and reduced to fighting for a few square miles of frozen rubble.